Hello and welcome to section 3, or the third week of this In Search of St. Paul. It's been a long time since we've been together. It's been about 2 months. I've missed you all. These have been very strange times and we're doing the best we can, but I asked Father Bill last week if I could continue the presentations, and he said please do. And so even though there are a lot of limitations to what we're going to do here today, we're going to make the best of it. I will warn you that you might see my little housemates Lily and Maddo from time to time, either see or hear them playing with their toys or jumping up on the table. So just tell them hi and remind them that they too should be reading the Acts of the Apostles and reading up on Paul if they want to participate in this. All right, this is the end of the test. Thank you. Okay. This is test number 2 of In Search of St. Paul. Welcome. We're going to do our best today. I hope you can see my head, which you could not see in the first test. I'm in my dining room. My cats are around me, and I hope that you can see me. I think I'm going to face you. I think that would be a better way to do this. Okay. Third and final test, presentation of St. Paul. I'm in my dining room. The cats are driving me nuts. We're going to see if this works. I want you to be able to kind of like see my head. I think that would be a good thing. Okay. Hello, welcome to In Search of St. Paul. This is week 3. Weeks 1 and 2 were way back when, in early March. Since then we've been away from the parish for, hard to believe, 2 months. And so now we will resume. Father Bill last week gave me the go-ahead to continue with the series. I'm looking forward to it. I miss you all. I wish we could be in the same room together, but I understand why we can't. We all need to stay safe and stay healthy and keep our distance from each other. So, given the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're going to do the best we can to talk about St. Paul, the real St. Paul. Fifth and final test of St. Paul. I'm testing to see if the volume is better, and also if you can continue to see my head. The cats, I'm now quite sure, are going to be a part of this presentation. Okay. Hello, welcome back to In Search of the Real St. Paul. It's been 2 months since we last convened. A lot has happened over those last 2 months, but last week Father Bill gave me the go-ahead and encouraged me to do this third, and then I will do also the 4th presentation on St. Paul within about a week or so. Before we get into week 3, which has to do with St. Paul as he is depicted in the Acts of the Apostles, versus St. Paul as he talks about himself in his own letters, I want to do a little bit of a review from weeks 1 and 2. I know that you remember everything from weeks 1 and 2. It's only been 2 months, but just in case. So in week 1, we talked about the different phases or faces of Paul. I had mentioned that Paul, there are 13 letters attributed to St. Paul, but that only 6 of them seem to be genuine. And the others either are of questionable origin or are almost certainly not written by St. Paul. So I said that there was both external and internal evidence of why those letters may not have been written by Paul, or almost certainly were not written by Paul. And then we also talked about, the letter to the Hebrews. We said that it almost certainly is not Pauline in origin. There are other letters supposedly written by Paul. We looked at some of the non-canonical works about Paul, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Apocalypse of Paul. And so the position that I took here is that the real Paul is found only in his authentic letters. And then in the other 6 letters, his message was either altered or, it even contradicts what he says in the genuine letters. So I said that the message of Paul can be divided into 4 different faces or phases. There is radical Paul, real Paul, the Paul who appears in his authentic letters. These letters were written in the 50s, and so they are the earliest documents that we have of the Christian era. They predate the Gospels. It's important to keep that in mind because they shed light upon Christianity as it was before the time of the Gospels. Then there is conservative Paul, who is in the disputed letters, and I'll explain a little bit about that. And then there is reactionary Paul, whose message appears in the inauthentic, those letters that Paul almost certainly did not write. And then there is fourth Paul, whom we will take up today, and that is Paul as he is depicted in the Acts of the Apostles. So, I took then a look at conservative Paul. Paul's message as he appears in the letters to the Ephesians, Colossians, and the second letter to the Thessalonians. And I noticed that, or I made a comment on the fact that the message on slavery in both Colossians and Ephesians is watered down from what it was in the letter to Philemon. And I talked about the letter to Philemon in the second week, and I'll review that. The letters to the Colossians and the Ephesians take acceptance of slave ownership as something that's perfectly normal. That's not the message of Paul in the letter to Philemon. And then there is the message on relationships within households. In Colossians and Ephesians, there is a hierarchy there of husbands over wives, fathers over children, and masters over slaves. Those relationships are not written about that way in the authentic letters of Paul. So that's something that we should take note of. Then there was reactionary Paul. Paul as he appears in 1st and 2nd Timothy and in the letter to Titus, which were written much later, in the 90s or maybe even in the 2nd century. So they're well after Paul would have been deceased. And the situation in the Christian era would have been far different by the 90s or in the first decade of the 2nd century than they would have been at the time of Paul. So, for example, Titus, in the letter to Titus, the 2nd chapter, there is nothing said about the mutuality of obligations between slaves and masters. Very different than what Paul himself would have said. The first letter to Timothy, in its second chapter, it talks about the question of female leadership in worship, but it expressly forbids it. Okay, it says that women are to remain silent. All right. So those are some examples of reactionary Paul. Then there is 1 Timothy chapter 3 and the letter to Titus chapter 1 verses 5 to 9, where the author talks about the requirements for an elder, a bishop, or a deacon, that he must be above reproach, married only once, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. The leader must be male, married, and have children. So what we see here is a church that is already beginning to accommodate itself to the demands of the Roman Empire, and thus a very different Christianity than during the time of Paul's life. In week 2, we talked about the real Paul, the genuine Paul, as he appears in his authentic letters. And we said that the message of the true Paul, the genuine Paul, is a message of equality. And what's important about that in my mind is that that message reflects far more accurately the message of Jesus himself. Jesus, as we know in his preaching on the reign of God, talked about radical equality, the equality of slaves and masters, the equality of men and women, of lepers, of centurions, of Samaritans, of tax collectors, of widows, of all kinds of people who would have been considered unacceptable in the eyes of Roman and even much of Jewish society. Paul picks up on that. And he says that the sources of our radical equality are two. First, it's our baptism, when he says in 1 Corinthians, "In the one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slave or free, and we are all made to drink of the one Spirit." The second basis for radical equality in Paul is kenosis, or self-emptying. So Paul says in the letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God something to be grasped. Rather, he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave." He emptied himself. That is the meaning of kenosis. He emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, coming in human likeness, and found human in appearance, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Okay? So Paul says that we are to live in imitation of Christ's kenosis, or self-emptying. Okay? And that when we do that, when we imitate Christ's kenosis, even though he was in the form of God, he became one of us. He became a man. So when we empty ourselves, that should allow us to see that every one of us is equal, no matter our status in society. Okay. So the radical Paul, or genuine Paul, talks about the equality of slaves and their owners. And I mentioned the letter to Philemon, in which Paul pleads with Philemon to free his slave Onesimus, who has run away from him, and not only to treat him as a spiritual brother, but to treat him as a true brother, someone who is equal, to grant him his freedom, his absolute freedom. That's a radical statement at a time when slavery was so common in the Roman Empire. Radical Paul, or genuine Paul, also speaks about equality in the family, and you can see that in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 7. So in this chapter, Paul goes out of his way to say that any obligation of the wife must be balanced by an equal obligation on the part of the husband. And I went through the various examples of that when it has to do with sexual abstinence, on divorce, on mixed marriage, on virginity. So there is a deliberate, conscious equality of male and female throughout 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Okay? I also talked about Paul's emphasis on equality in the assembly for worship. The first was the example in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the passage about women covering their heads for worship. Okay? What's noteworthy there is that Paul says that both women can and should pray and prophesy. What that means is that both men and women have a very formal role to play in the worship service. The example number 2 is the Lord's Supper, or the agape meal, that he talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 to 22. Paul is critical there of the Corinthians, especially the wealthy Corinthians, because he says everyone was supposed to bring food, but they bring better food. And then when it comes time to eat, they don't share their food with the poor. The poor end up eating their spam, and while the wealthy are dining on their steaks. Paul says, bring cheaper food, but whatever you bring, share it with everyone who comes. That's a message of equality under Christ. He also, in Romans chapter 16, verses 1 through 16, he talks about equality as apostles. And in those verses, he mentions 27 names. 10 of those are women. He talks about Phoebe, who is a deacon, and also a benefactor, a prostatus, a benefactor of Paul. In other words, women were able to do all the things that men could do within the Romans community. Okay. What's even, I think, of more importance is Radical Paul's understanding of peace and of the death and resurrection of Christ. Because here he stands in stark contrast to the Roman understanding of peace. Remember, I said that the Roman understanding of peace was that peace was achieved along a 4-step path of religion, war, victory, and then peace. So the Romans would offer sacrifices to their gods. They would then go to war believing that the gods were on their side. They would achieve victory, but victory through violence and conquest. And then that would be peace. That was the Pax Romana. It was peace through military victory. It was peace through violence. Such is not the case with Paul. Paul has a radically different concept of peace. He says that peace begins with the fact that Jesus is referred to not just as our Lord, but as the Lord. He is the true Lord, not the emperor. It's a very radical, in fact, it's a treasonous statement on Paul's part. Then Paul goes on to say that Christians should be committed to the justice that grows out of equality. So Paul refers to God as a father and as a good father. And what does a good father do? In the eyes of Paul, a good father is one who believes in equality, who believes that everyone has what they need, that no one goes without, just as any father, any good father would. So God, the Father, believes in justice, believes that everyone should have what they need to live a good life. In other words, everyone should be treated as equals. So for Paul, peace is achieved not through victory or violence. Peace is achieved only when there is justice on earth. Interestingly enough, this vision of peace is that which is picked up by the modern Catholic social teaching. It talks about the concept of peace at length, but it says that peace is more than just the mere absence of war. It reminds us that peace is the restoration of that order which God intended from the very beginning. An order which is based on equality and justice, where everyone is treated as an equal and everyone has everything that they need to live a good life. And now you are meeting one of my two cats, Maddo, who will be strolling I'm sure, through my makeshift studio as we go through this. So welcome to the presentation, Maddo. I hope you brought your notepad and pen. So anyway, on and on we go. And so Paul goes on to say that the cross and resurrection reveal the way to a new life based in Christ. And this new life is discovered or found through participation in the death and resurrection of Jesus, by dying and rising with Christ. And so I mentioned that this is not what came to be known as substitutionary atonement, that Christ did the work of salvation for us, that Christ took upon himself our sins and died in our stead. That is not the message of Paul. In fact, that is not the message of Jesus either. That's something that evolved out of those ideas, but much later. What Paul is talking about is not substitutionary atonement, but something that we've mentioned before, participatory atonement. That we are to die and rise with Christ by the way that we live. And how do we do that? We do that by dying, by experiencing our own crucifixion to the normalcy of the world in which power and violence are dominant. And by rising to that understanding that Paul and which Jesus himself tried to teach us. Peace through justice. In other words, dying to imperial violence and rising to God's equality and justice. Okay, so enough about that. One other thing, and that's Radical Paul's understanding of justification by faith. Justification by faith is a concept that is understood differently by different Christians. Catholics understand it differently than most Protestants and evangelicals. So I mentioned that justification answers the question, how do I get to heaven? How will I be judged? And traditionally, this debate has centered on either faith or works. So Luther, at the time of the Reformation, Martin Luther, disagreed vehemently with the Catholic understanding that we need to do good works in order to to live the Christian life. Luther said that it was by faith alone, sola fide, that we are saved. And that theme was taken up by other reformers. It has been one of the hallmarks of much of Protestantism and evangelicalism throughout the centuries. But I believe, on the basis of those authors that I've read, that justification by faith means something different than what Luther thought. So, and it's based on Paul. For Paul, faith is not the acceptance of what Jesus did for me. It is rather, faith is my commitment, my personal commitment to the transformation of the world. And so, if I truly believe, if I have faith, then I will do the works that Jesus did. I will do the works that will help to bring about that peace based on justice that Jesus preached about and that Paul preached about. Okay? So a very different understanding of justification by faith. All right, enough review. Now it's time for us to talk about St. Paul as he is discussed in the Acts of the Apostles, as he's presented in the Acts of the Apostles, which of course were not written by him, as opposed to Paul in his authentic letters. So, first, some introductory remarks about the Acts of the Apostles. We've looked at it before. As you know, the Acts of the Apostles is a sequel to the Gospel of Luke. It is a continuation of the Gospel of Luke. It is an account that begins with the Ascension and Pentecost, and it ends with the spreading of the Gospel to Rome. So the Gospel of Luke ends with verses like this, or with Jesus' commission to the disciples. Repentance and the forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in His name to all nations, beginning in Jerusalem. And so the Acts of the Apostles is the fulfillment of that command by Jesus, because where does, in Luke anyway, or in Acts, where does the preaching of the gospel begin? It begins in Jerusalem. Where does it end? It ends in the capital of the great Roman Empire. It ends in Rome itself. And so it shows that the disciples have fulfilled Jesus' command to preach the gospel and repentance of sins to the ends of the earth. Okay, so when was the Acts of the Apostles written? There's quite a bit of debate and difference about this. Up until a few years ago, I would have said that I believe the Acts of the Apostles was written sometime in the decade of the 80s, shortly after the Gospel of Luke. But I now see evidence that it may have been written as late as the year 110. And so either way you look at it, by that time the situation of the church had changed radically. Primarily what had happened, and we've discussed this before, the second generation of Christians had to evolve or change their understanding of the imminent return of Christ. Jerusalem had been destroyed, the temple had been destroyed, and Jesus did not return, even though it appears that he had promised that he would return very soon. So what we see in the Acts of the Apostles is more of a spreading of the message to the nations. Why would you need to spread the message of Jesus to all the nations if he were going to be returning imminently, if he were going to be returning at any time? It wouldn't make any sense. By the 80s and 90s, it began to make more sense. It came into the minds of the early Christians that they had best spread the gospel message, that it was not just for Israel, that it was not just for Jews, but that it was for Jews and Gentiles alike. We see that in the Acts of the Apostles. So there are two major divisions in Acts. Chapters 1 through 8, or in chapters 1 through 8, Peter is the prime subject. And in chapters 9 through 28, Paul is the primary character, and it deals with his conversion and his missionary journeys. Okay, so the author of Acts depicts Paul as the person who was primarily responsible for the spread of Christianity. Once Paul arrives on the scene, the other apostles kind of recede into the background. Did it really happen that way? Probably not. One of the early struggles within the early Christian movement was over authority. So, who is that authority who best understands and can lead this fledgling movement? Some said it was Peter, some said it was James, some said it was Thomas, some said it was John, some said it was Paul. And the author of Luke and Acts, or the author anyway of the Acts of the Apostles, believes that Paul is the most legitimate authority, the one who can, who should be responsible for the spread of the Christian message. Okay, note that in the Acts of the Apostles, both Peter and Paul deliver speeches. But it's important to note that these speeches were not written by Peter or Paul, and were not delivered as they are written in the Acts of the Apostles. They were written by the author of Acts. They are staged in the immediate aftermath of Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. But they are written 50, 60, 70 years later. They are retrojected back into a previous time. Note that this this practice of writing speeches for somebody else was common in ancient literature. So, let's take any author from those times. If he was not present when a speech was given, and he probably wasn't, then he would compose the speech, put it into the mouth of the speaker based on what he knew or what he had heard about that speaker. So whoever wrote the speeches of Peter and Paul in the Acts of the Apostles was not present when those speeches would have been delivered. And so they're framed around the context of Acts itself, and they're framed around the context a context which was far different than the situation in the immediate aftermath of Jesus leaving this earth. Okay? Let me say just a little bit more about that. So, the author of Acts is now living and writing in the 80s or 90s or 100s. He was not present in the immediate aftermath of Jesus' death and resurrection. It's a good chance he never laid eyes on Peter or Paul or Andrew or Thomas or any of the apostles. But he had heard about them. So his charge was to write the Acts of the Apostles for the audience of his time. And so, as so many of the biblical authors did, he retrojects these speeches of Peter and Paul back 50 or 60 or 70 years to make it appear as though the early Christian movement, A, began in Jerusalem, B, spread to Rome within a few years' time, and C, that Paul was the most prominent disciple and the most prominent authority of the early Christian movement. Okay? That's his viewpoint. Okay, so some other things about Paul, about what we understand about Paul. Most of the books that are written about Paul, most of those that have a timeline about the events of his life are based on the Acts of the Apostles. The trouble is, there's not a whole lot of congruence between Paul's ministry as it appears in the Acts of the Apostles and Paul's ministry as he writes about it himself in his own letters. So the story of Paul in Acts is not meant to be biographical, okay? Its purpose is to place Paul within the context of the growth of the early church. Okay, so just as with the Gospels, in which the events of Jesus' life are not meant to be understood as biography, so the same is true of the Acts of the Apostles. The events of Paul's life and ministry here are not meant as biography. They are placed in a larger context, that context being the beginning and the evolution of the early Christian movement. Okay? All right. So, for one thing, the Acts of the Apostles makes no mention whatsoever of Paul ever having written any letters. And we do have solid evidence that he did, in fact, write several letters. What I think, the second bit of evidence that shows the difference between the two is that the Acts of the Apostles is a much more exciting and entertaining read than Paul's letters. For example, if you look at the 22nd chapter, chapter 22 of Acts, there's a chase scene in it. So, Paul says, after I had returned to Jerusalem and while I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw Jesus saying to me, hurry and get out of Jerusalem quickly because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And while the blood of your witness Stephen was shed, I myself was standing by, approving and keeping the coats of those who killed him. Then Jesus said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. In other words, get out of Dodge, okay? So that's one example. There is a last-minute escape in the Acts of the Apostles. If we go back to chapter 12, verses 6 through 11. The very night before Herod was going to bring him out, Peter, bound with 2 chains, was sleeping between 2 soldiers, while guards in front of the door were keeping watch over the prison. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared and a light shone in the cell. He tapped Peter on the side and woke him, saying, get up quickly. And the chains fell off his wrists. The angel said to him, fasten your belt and put on your sandals. He did so. Then he said to him, wrap your cloak around you and follow me. Peter went out and followed him. He did not realize that what was happening with the angel's help was real. He thought he was seeing a vision. So Peter escapes from prison with the help of an angel. Very exciting. There are other things. I could go through a whole list of them. There are murderous plots against Paul. There are stonings. We know about the stoning of Stephen. There's drama in the courtroom. Let me take you to chapter 18, verses 12 through 17. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. In other words, brought him to trial. They said, this man is persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law. Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, If it were a matter of crime or serious villainy, I would be justified in accepting the complaint of you Jews. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I do not wish to be a judge of these matters. And he dismissed them from the tribunal. Then all of them seized Sosthenes, the official of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of these things. So that's one of a few courtroom scenes that take place in the Acts of the Apostles. In the 16th chapter, there is an earthquake. In one scene, Paul has a debate with Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. That's pretty cool. Let me read you about the death of Herod in the 12th chapter, verses 20 through 23. This is the death of Herod. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. So they came to him in a body, and after winning over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for a reconciliation, because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat on the platform, and delivered a public address to them. The people kept shouting, "The voice of a god and not of a mortal." And immediately, because he had not given the glory to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. What a way to go, okay? So poor Herod was eaten by worms. We read about a riot that takes place in the city of Ephesus. In the 21st chapter of Acts, we read about a crowd that tries to kill Paul. In chapter 28, verses 1 through 6, Paul is bitten by a snake. Let me read you one little thing about a shipwreck in chapter 27, which is a quite interesting thing. So I won't read it all because it's fairly long. This is chapter 27, beginning with verse 13. When a moderate south wind began to blow, they thought that they could achieve their purpose, so they weighed anchor and began to sail past Crete, close to the shore. But soon a violent wind, called the northeaster, rushed down from Crete. Since the ship was caught and could not be turned head-on into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven. By running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After hoisting it up, they took measures to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run on the Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and so were driven. We were being pounded by the storm so violently that on the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard, and on the third day, with their own hands, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete, and thereby avoided this damage and loss. I urge you now to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor," so on and so on. The long and short of it is this, that there is a shipwreck, but amazingly, there were 276 people on the ship, and not one of them died. Truly miraculous. And now you might be able to see, although she just left the picture, my other little kitty cat, Lily. Hello, Lily. Thank you for joining us. One of the best stories, I think, or most fantastic stories anyway, is in the 20th chapter of Acts, starting with verse 7. Help me find it, Lily. Okay. On the first day of the week, when we met to break bread, Paul was holding a discussion with them. Since he intended to leave the next day, he continued speaking until midnight. Father Bill is a much better preacher than that, no doubt. There were many lamps in the room upstairs where we were meeting. A young man named Eutychus, who was sitting in the window, began to sink off into a deep sleep while Paul talked still longer. Overcome by sleep, he fell to the ground 3 floors below and was picked up dead. But Paul went down and bending over him, took him in his arms and said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." Then Paul went upstairs, and after he had broken bread and eaten, he continued to convene with them until dawn. Then he left. Meanwhile, they had taken the boy away alive and were not a little comforted. So Eutychus falls asleep, falls 3 floors to his death. Paul brings the boy back to life and then continues with his sermon. Amazing. Okay. Let's see. One of the things that both Acts and Paul in his own letters agree about is that Paul was a fervent Jew, a Pharisaic Jew, that he lived and died as a Jew, a Christian Jew. Okay? He says in the 11th chapter of the letter to the Romans, "I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin." And he makes that claim in other places, in 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philemon, and in several places in Acts. Okay? The author of Acts calls Paul a son of the Pharisees, and it is the author of Acts who makes the claim that Paul was instructed by a Pharisee named Gamaliel, and that is the standard belief, that he was a student of Gamaliel. However, it's more likely that Paul was educated at was educated at Damascus and not by Gamaliel. And why? Because Gamaliel did not advocate persecuting Christians. Okay? So Paul was a persecutor of Christians. Gamaliel did not advocate persecuting Christians. Why would Paul have not followed the advice of his teacher? In Acts 5:38, Gamaliel says, "Keep away from these men, Christians, and leave them alone." Okay. The other bit of evidence against his having been taught in Jerusalem by Gamaliel is that he writes his letters in very high quality Greek, which means that he probably learned Greek outside of Palestine. Okay? So, another thing, the author of Acts says that Paul was a Roman citizen. And it was because of his Roman citizenship that he was allowed, when he was arrested in Jerusalem, to have his trial in Rome, which the Acts of the Apostles tells us. However, Paul himself never mentions that he was a Roman citizen, and there are times when he actually implies that he was most definitely not a Roman citizen. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25, he says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Okay? Why is that important? Well, because Roman citizens were not to be beaten with rods. That was not a punishment that would be inflicted upon a Roman citizen. Okay? So, both Paul and Acts, and this is a key point, both Paul and Acts agree that Paul was a persecutor of Christian Jews. The difference is that Acts has Paul persecute Christians in Jerusalem, where Paul himself does not. So, why would Paul even have persecuted Christian Jews? It's hard to say. There's very little evidence of Paul's motive in Acts of the Apostles or in Paul's own letters. One of the scholars that I read, Dr. Bart Ehrman, he believes that Paul, prior to his experience on the road to Damascus, he may have been outraged or may have rejected the thought that that Jesus was the Messiah. Why? Because he was crucified. Paul may very well have been one of those Jews who would have found it incomprehensible that the Messiah would die, because in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, it says, cursed be anyone who hangs on a tree. Jesus was hung on a tree, on a cross. And so Paul may have been deeply opposed to the idea or the affirmation that Jesus could have been the Messiah because of his crucifixion. But that's the best rationale for his persecution of Christian Jews that I could find anyway. Okay. So, next point. In the Acts of the Apostles, there's a pattern to Paul's missionary activity. This is what happens. He arrives in a town and he preaches in their synagogue. You can see it in a number of places there. The Jews in the synagogue reject him, and then Paul preaches to the Gentiles outside the synagogue. Okay? That's the pattern. Paul goes into the synagogue and preaches. The Jews in the synagogue reject him. Paul goes outside the synagogue and preaches to Gentiles. Okay. But this is not the pattern of Paul's preaching as described by himself in his own letters. Okay? There he says that his primary mission is to preach to the Gentiles. So if his primary mission is to preach to the Gentiles, why would he go into the synagogue first and preach to the Jews? Okay? There are some scholars, however, who believe that Paul may have preached in the synagogues, but he may have preached to those Gentiles who would have attended synagogue service. These people are known as God-fearers, and they are mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. So who are the God-fearers? The God-fearers are Gentiles. They don't convert to Judaism, but they accept Jewish monotheism. They respected the morality or the ethical system of the Jews. They respected the family ethics and communal values of the Jews and attended synagogue, but they never converted to Judaism. These God-fearers are mentioned often in the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 10, in chapter 13, chapter 16, 17, and 18. Okay? Acts is always careful to distinguish the God-fearers from the, quote, the real Jews or the full Jews. Okay? The Acts of the Apostles maintains that the Jews were jealous of Paul because pagans, namely these God-fearers, accepted his message of Christianity while the Jews refused it. I'll repeat that. The position of Acts, the author of Acts, is that the Jews were jealous of Paul because even though the God-fearers would not convert to Judaism, they would convert, at least they would not convert to their brand of Judaism. They did convert to Paul's brand of Judaism, namely Christian Judaism. Okay? At the same time, note that at the same time, the pagans from whom the God-fearers came, the pagans would have been upset with Paul too, because he was converting them from paganism to Christian Judaism. So in real life, the Jews, the non-Christian Jews would have been jealous of Paul because they were taking people away from them. And the pagans as well would have been jealous of Paul because he was taking the God-fearers away from them. The God-fearers who had been pagans. Okay? So both, non-Christian Jews and pagans would have been upset with Paul because he was in effect poaching. He was stealing members from their numbers. Okay, let's look at the story of Paul's conversion in the Acts of the Apostles and then in his own letters. The conversion story, and I use that in quotes, the conversion story in Acts is in chapter 9. So we're familiar with the story. Saul, his name is Saul, he encounters Jesus. He is blinded. The voice from heaven says, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Saul goes to Damascus where he meets a man named Ananias. Ananias heals him of his blindness. Saul is baptized. He begins to preach in the synagogues of Damascus. Notice, he begins to preach in the synagogues of Damascus, which causes the local Jews to want to kill him. He escapes Damascus by being lowered in a basket over the city wall. Then he goes to Jerusalem to join the disciples. In Jerusalem, the disciples are afraid of him because he had been a persecutor. His companion Barnabas convinces them that Paul is okay. Paul joins them in preaching in Jerusalem, and then Paul is sent off to Tarsus to preach. That's the story in the Acts of the Apostles. Okay, one thing to note about that story became a paradigm. That story became a model of the conversion stories of Christians. Okay? Especially Jews who became Christians. Jews who became Christians were especially held up in high esteem because they imitated the conversion of Paul from Judaism to an entirely different religion, Christianity. Of course, that's not what happened, but that's how the meaning of the story evolved. Paul did not help to found a different religion. At least, that was not his intent nor his mission. His mission was to reform and change Judaism. Why? Because of the death and resurrection of Christ. Okay, but Paul, from day one until the day he died, was always a Jew. That's not the way the understanding of his journey to Damascus came to be understood. Okay. Something to note about this story in Acts 9, the story of the journey to Damascus, is that the author of Acts models some of the details of Paul after the story of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. So he draws a parallel between Paul in Acts and Jesus in Luke. Both Jesus and Paul are traveling preachers. Okay? Number two, both of them gather, a few Jewish followers, not many, but mostly they antagonize the Jews. And the Jews want to kill them, both Jesus and Paul. And for both Jesus in Luke and Paul in Acts, Jewish crowds and Jewish authorities are far more hostile to both Jesus and Paul than are the Roman crowds and authorities. What do we see here? In Luke, remember when it's written, in the 80s, after the destruction of the temple, when Judaism and Christianity are just barely beginning to go their separate ways. In Luke, we begin to see the stereotyping of Jews as people who were opposed to Jesus and opposed to anyone who believed in Jesus. And this interpretation would eventually lead to the belief that Christianity is superior to Judaism. Okay? And so this conversion story of Paul is used as the first example of how an individual, namely Paul, converts entirely from one religion to the next, to another. He was a Jew and he abandoned Judaism and became a Christian. Okay? That's how the narrative evolved. That's not really how Paul understood his own transformation. Okay. Here are the problems with the Acts story. The Acts story of the journey to Damascus and the aftermath. There are problems with it, okay? First problem. The author of Acts claims that the high priest had given Paul the authority to bring back dissident Jewish Christians from Damascus to Jerusalem. Okay? Acts makes that claim, that Paul was acting under the auspices and the direction of the high priest to round up Jewish Christian or Christian Jewish converts and bring them back to Jerusalem. Okay? And here's the quote from Acts. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way being Christianity, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Here's the problem with that little detail in Acts, okay, and kind of renders it fictional. It would have been impossible because the high priest did not have the authority to carry out a sentence of capital punishment. Just as the high priest in Jesus' time did not have the authority to bring about a sentence of capital punishment. Okay? So Paul's role as a persecutor is being inflated here. Okay. That's point number one. Point number two, I have to learn how to slow myself down. I kind of get revved up, and I don't have Lee or David Sullivan. I don't have Dick Costco or Dave Taylor, my trusty cinematographers, to kind of slow me down. So I have to do it on my own. All right. So second point, in the Acts story, it says that Paul saw a light from heaven and heard the voice of Christ. But Paul's own description of that event in the letter to the Galatians, chapter 1, verses 11 through 17, is different. He says that he saw the Lord, that he had a vision of the Lord. He didn't hear the Lord, he saw the Lord. Okay? He mentions Damascus, and it appears that he may have been persecuting Christians there, but there is no mention, Paul makes no mention in his own hand of having the authority to take prisoners back to Jerusalem. Okay? And Paul makes the claim that it was in seeing Christ, not hearing Christ, but in seeing the risen Christ that made him a follower, an apostle. Okay? So very different. He also says that it was in seeing Christ that he became one of the 12. He became an apostle, even though he had never laid eyes on Jesus. Okay. There's also a big difference between the Acts of the Apostles and Paul's own understanding of it, between the meaning of this experience, this Damascus experience. In Acts, Paul became an apostle when he was sent by the communities in Jerusalem and Antioch. Okay, so it's only at the end of the story. It's not in the journey on to Damascus. It's not on the road and seeing the light and hearing the voice. That's not what made him an apostle. It was being commissioned by somebody else. Notice the authority issue there. He is commissioned by others, okay, in the Acts of the Apostles. In his own letters, Paul says that it was the Damascus experience itself. It was his vision, his actual seeing of Jesus that made him an apostle. He was not commissioned by anyone else but Jesus himself. Okay? Paul was not short on ego, I should add. Okay? All right. Then there is the story of Paul after the Damascus experience. So, we've already been through it, but I'll repeat a little bit of it. So Acts says that after he arrived in Damascus, he was cured of his blindness by Ananias, and he was baptized. It then says that he spent, quote, many days in Damascus, preaching to the Jews in the synagogues, we've already been through that, proving that Jesus is the Messiah. That's a quote. And it was that message of attempting to prove that Jesus is the Messiah which caused the Jews in the Damascus synagogue to want to kill him, to kill Paul. Paul's understanding of the Damascus experience is quite different. Okay? In Galatians chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, Paul says that after Damascus, he went to Arabia for 3 years. Okay? There are some, and we're not sure why he went to Arabia. He doesn't say what he did there. But there are some scholars who say he went there to meditate on his new calling. He went there to, be alone and in solitude to prepare himself for what he was about to do. But others say that he began his career as an apostle, as a missionary in Arabia, by preaching to the Arabs in Jordan, or the country was called Nabatea at that time. Okay? So there's that. There's the very different understanding, okay, of that, of what happens right after he gets to Damascus. Then there is also the question of Paul's escape from Damascus. The description of the escape is different in Acts versus what Paul himself says about it. So in Acts, it is said that Paul escaped from the Jewish religious authorities who wanted to kill him for trying to prove that Jesus was the Messiah in their synagogues. Okay? But there's a problem with that. How could the Jews control the gates of Damascus? Damascus was an Arab city. The Jewish authorities would not have had control over the gates of Damascus. Now, in his own words, Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 says that he escaped from King Aretas, who was an Arab authority, an Arab political authority. Now, the Arabs would have had control over the gates of Damascus, so that makes more sense. But why, there still is the question, why would King Aretas have wanted to capture Paul in the first place? Well, think about it. Perhaps because he had spent 3 years in Arab Nabatea, in Arab Jordan, preaching to Arabs. That could easily have angered the Aretas, the Arab authority in Damascus. So, in a lot of ways, it seems to make more sense that, Paul's story just seems to make more sense. It seems to coincide more with the reality, the political and religious reality of Damascus at that time. Okay. Now, I am getting close to wrapping up here. Maybe you wrapped up a half an hour ago and turned it off. I don't know. I wouldn't blame you. So the last points that I want to get into here, the last points of difference between the Acts of the Apostles and Paul's own letters, have to do with the two debates that he engaged in with some of the other apostles. The first one was the debate at Jerusalem, whether Gentile males who converted to Christian Judaism had to be circumcised. Okay? There were those who believed that if a Gentile converted to Christianity, that they had to be circumcised. These guys are called the Judaizers. There were others who said, no, they don't. That's not a big deal. They do not have to be circumcised. So, the 15th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles reports that some of the believers who were Pharisees argued that the new Gentile Christians should be circumcised. Both Peter and James, however, both speak up in favor of not demanding circumcision. Especially in the case of James, that would not have made much sense. James, who was the leader of the Christian community in Jerusalem, was a staunch Judaizer. So that just doesn't seem to make much sense. But in the end, there was agreement among the apostles that they need not be. All the apostles say, okay, Gentiles do not have to be circumcised. Okay? There is a slight difference in Paul's letter to the Galatians, in chapter 2 of Galatians. Paul says that he and Barnabas and Titus went to Jerusalem in response to a revelation. They received a vision. Notice here we're talking about an era of prophetism and an era of charismatic Christianity. They went there they went there in response to a revelation, a vision, to discuss the issue of circumcision. Paul said even for Titus, who was a Greek, that circumcision had not been required. And so in the end, Paul and Barnabas were given the okay to not demand circumcision. Okay? However, James, Peter, and John would preach to the circumcised. Paul would preach to the uncircumcised, to the Gentiles. Peter, James, and John would preach to those who were already circumcised. Okay, so there's that one. The more serious discrepancy between Acts and Paul himself has to do with the debate that took place at Antioch. The debate there had to do with whether or not a mixed community of Jewish and Gentile Christians should observe Jewish kosher laws when they held their Eucharistic meals together. Okay? So, should they, when they get together for the agape meal, the Eucharistic meal, should they obey the Jewish kosher laws, or do they not have to? Before they became Christians, the Gentiles naturally would not be kosher. So, should everyone be kosher, or should no one eat kosher? The custom at that time in the Antioch community was for no one to eat kosher, whether they had been Jews or not. And now, remember, they are considered Christian Jews, but they are not eating kosher. Okay, so Acts 15, 15th chapter of Acts, says that Paul and Barnabas were sent to Antioch along with Judas and Silas to read a letter from the apostles in Jerusalem. Okay, so they're commissioned by all the apostles in Jerusalem with this letter. The letter instructs the Gentiles to, and this is a quote from Acts, the letter instructs the Gentiles to, quote, abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. Okay? In other words, the Gentiles should eat kosher. They go to Antioch, the letter is read, everyone accepts it. End of story. Paul accepts it, everybody accepts it, everything's cool. That's one of the undercurrents of the Acts of the Apostles in general, that there was this great unanimity among the apostles. There was not. Okay? There was not. But Acts, written much later, wants us to believe that there was a spirit of unanimity among the apostles. Okay. In the letter to the Galatians, chapter 2, verses 11 to 14, Paul tells us a much different story. And now I'm quoting. Paul writes, when Cephas, or Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles, because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews, which means the apostles, joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? So Paul in Galatians admits that everybody, even Barnabas, disagrees with his position. Paul does not believe that the Gentile converts should eat kosher, and neither did Peter before, and neither did Barnabas before the guys from Jerusalem came up and the Judaizers came up and said, hey, you better all be eating kosher. So they are being hypocrites. Paul is calling them out on their hypocrisy. Okay, these apostles, Peter and the others, they practice kosher only when the pro-circumcision Judaizers tell them they should, or when the pro-circumcision Judaizers tell them that they should, or show up and tell them that they should. So, I know that's a lot. I feel badly that we can't have a dialogue about this. I know you would have had plenty of great questions. As you could see, Lily and Maddo had no questions. In fact, showed very little interest in this talk at all. I'm kind of disappointed in them, I'll be honest. Let me just tell you, too, that I look forward to the time when we can get back together again. I miss you all at St. Nicholas. I wish you all safety and health. To those who watch this from St. Nicholas and from anywhere else, my friends from the shrine, my friends from other parishes, and anybody else who happens to take the time to watch this, please stay safe. Please stay healthy. Let's continue to think about each other, pray for each other. And I hope to be able to do the fourth of these talks, fourth and final of these talks, probably by the end of this week or maybe by the beginning of next week. Thank you so much for watching, and be good.